The correct Harvard citation is Hart, PJ, and Luke, JA, November 2022, equal rights, in I've Never Read Discworld podcast. Welcome.
Hello there. Well, that was a bit traumatic for me. I just handed in my first piece of postgraduate coursework yesterday, so I was having a real kind of fright fest, Halloween fright fest with Harvard referencing. You didn't even know that, so that was a pretty apt intro. I love it. So welcome. This is the voice of PJ. You've just heard the voice of Andy, and this is I've Never Read Discworld. We are currently on book number 3. So if you've listened to the first 2 episodes of the podcast, you'll know that Andy and I usually pick the characters that we relate to from the story. So I'm being Granny Weatherwax in this episode, and I've got my witch's hat on to demonstrate. It's the day after Halloween as we record, so the witch's hat was still lying around the house. I think it fits me rather well.
I think it looks stunning. It gave me a great smile. Make sure you're on the video, because that was a bit fun.
Yeah, we'll maybe take a screenshot for those who can't see the video. So what character are you going with this month, Andy?
You know what? I'm going to go with Esk. Bit of an obvious one. I will talk more about that later. But
yes, please do.
Think of me as a young child in the world of the disc.
Okay, tell you what. I'll give you a few quick fire questions. Andy, what's the book called?
Equal Rights.
When was it published?
1987.
Where does it fall in the series?
It's book number 3.
Okay, and what is it about? Give us the blurb. You're holding it in your hand.
The last thing the wizard Drumbillet did before death laid a bony hand on his shoulder was to pass on his staff of power to the 8th son of an 8th son. Unfortunately for his colleagues in the chauvinistic, not to say misogynistic world of magic, he failed to check on the newborn baby's sex.
That's it? Wow, I had assumed it would have given more details on that. That's ruined part of my thesis about this book slightly, but actually leaves more to the imagination than I expected. So just in case we have any newcomers, because I know that there might be some people who might be joining us for this first book in the Witches strand. In terms of who we are and what we do, Andy has never read Discworld. This is his first time doing so. I have read Discworld. Almost all of Discworld. I had read this book before when I was very young. And so we explore that dynamic together. First impressions versus kind of a bit more of a retrospective, complete picture. And that is how we approach Discworld. So if Andy's happy enough, I think we should just jump straight in. Now, this is a very different kind of book, Andy, than what you've had so far. So let's get some first impressions from you straight off.
It is a much slower paced book. I'm really keen about that. I'm really interested in talking about that. It surprised me, the pacing of it.
Is it still funny? I mean, at the end of the day, this is a Discworld book. Did you still find yourself laughing? Or
yeah, but that also stuck out at me as well, because it's more smile funny than there's a few laugh out loud guffaws. It's not as restrictive as like early episodes of Dollhouse or Torchwood, but it's I don't think you could class it as a comedy per se.
Interesting. Okay. So in terms of the new protagonists we've met, because obviously the first 2 books dealt with the same protagonists. We had Rincewind and Twoflower. We had the Boys Club in books 1 and 2. Now you're meeting Granny and Escarina, the 2 female protagonists of book 3. And I just want to get your first impressions on those 2 as characters, as another kind of comedy fantasy duo, albeit a very different one.
Yeah, well, it's a very gentle tale. It really is about their relationship. Esk is really well written for a 9-year-old. There's a lot of character in there. She's curious, savvy, strong and determined, but by no means invulnerable. We see plenty of that and plenty of Esk getting it wrong. Granny is knowledgeable, very wise, very pig-headed in equal measure. I'm not really open to compromise. So it's kind of interesting watching the two of them grow together.
Absolutely. And it's probably something we'll get into as we discuss the specifics going forward. But I know that intergenerational relationship is something that stood out to you in this book compared to the more intercultural relationship, I suppose, that two Flora and Rincewind had, this intergenerational relationship. Do you think that there's possibly more fertile narrative ground there, or what was your impression?
Yeah, so a lot of the time, Granny is wrong about stuff, Granny Weatherwax. Um, the stories about her suffering and learning, and you get that sort of throughout the book, really, that sort of master or granny apprentice relationship between the two of them. And it also comments on typical family structures. Before Esk enters Granny's tutelage, you get very much the male voice is the loudest voice in the room, but Pratchett's fairly careful to make sure that that isn't the exclusive voice. In a way, it's anti-ideology. You can make a good argument for this isn't about gender or class. It's about characters. It's about people.
Hmm.
I find much more interesting.
My impression, perhaps based more on the series as a whole, in the round, as it were, is that there are theses in a lot of these books. You know, that there is ideology, but the fact that they are so well merged with the characters that the characters always take the front seat, always take precedent, and the kind of ideology or the thesis will always sit behind the characters. So I think this is kind of the first book to me that feels like a proper Discworld book, like a Discworld with a capital D, and that it obviously has, it's playing with a really concrete thesis, which is that girls are witches and boys are wizards. And then the whole kind of point of the book is challenging that thesis, I guess. So the fact that that's kind of plays out with through these really strong characters who have this really strong relationship is kind of like the real core of like what makes Pratchett's writing great.
Yeah, that's kind of a refrain of the book. I mean, that girls can't be wizards. Um, that they can only use certain types of magic. And I suspect probably that the word certain words are grouped together in that way and like played out again and again. The girls can't be wizards.
Yeah, interesting. I know sort of towards the start of the book, you know, we've mentioned that the pacing's very different, and like there's a lot of time spent with Esk and Granny before any serious wizarding really comes into play. We have the wizard that you mentioned when you read the blurb, Drum. He comes to town and hands off his staff to what turns out to be Esk.
Drum comes in and he decides that the staff is going to be passed down to the wizard, who turns out to be Esk, and he's shown to be wrong. But the kind of the sweeping generalizations of sort of ideology and gender politics aren't there because Drum is dying, and your sympathies are very much with him. We're kind of sensitive to his passing, and that's a nice little sort of almost like a bait and switch, as it were. I don't know if that's.
No, I think you're right actually, and the fact that he features prominently in the blurb, and hopefully not too much of a spoiler to say that he dies pretty much in the first 10 pages or something, and it's alluded to in the blurb. But the fact that he features prominently in it, I think that's fair to say it is a bit of a bait and switch because he's not a prominent character in the story. Although he does make appearance afterwards. I know you're down to talk about the talking trees.
This is now the third book in a row, towards the end of Act One, where we have had talking trees. So, new rule: for every book where this happens, we are going to have a tree time section.
Yes, I'm all for it.
So I didn't know much about trees. I wanted to have a little read, so
he's brandishing his notes at me menacingly.
I have notes. I read a piece called "The Whispering Trees" in Smithsonian Magazine. It generally is framed around the story of Peter Wolleben, a German forester and author. He used to sort of butcher trees, and now he's all about preserving trees. Um, and he found an awful lot of interesting things in his studies. So basically, there's fungi around the roots of trees, which enable them to talk, trade, and fight. Seedlings get sugars and water piped in. Some people call it the wood wide web, which I really like.
That's
Uh,
very Pratchett. The wood. Yeah, I love that.
the fungal or mycorrhizal network. Um, Chemicals that come through. There's a few really interesting ones I picked out. If a tree is under attack, um, so when a deer is biting a branch, the tree brings defending chemicals to make the leaves taste bad.
Mm.
When elms and piles come under attack by leaf-eating caterpillars, they detect the caterpillar's saliva and release pheromones. They attract parasitic wasps. There's all kinds of really interesting ways in which they communicate through the air using pheromones and other sense signals. There's like a voltage based signaling system that is strikingly similar to animals' nervous system. Um, Generally, they'll talk about alarm and distress. And I'll just read this little bit as it's kind of a apt. We reach an area that he calls the classroom. Young beech trees, in their own individual ways, are tackling the fundamental challenge of their existence. Like any tree, they crave sunlight, but down here below the canopy, only 3% of the light in the forest is available. And in this classroom bit, the bigger trees are passing chemicals and water and sun down to the smaller saplings. Now, there's been some criticisms of this kind of approach. That we as humans are only too quick to ascribe thinking and feeling and speaking to trees.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Ancient Greece, they delivered prophecies. Here we have them whispering unreliable clues to go out in search of leprechaun gold.
Indeed.
You've got the Wizard of Oz. You've got the Ents. You're a
Oh yes,
guy?
indeed.
Yeah.
Well, I'm aware of an Ent. I've seen an Ent or two on a cinema screen.
What can you tell me about the Ents? Because I've never read Lord of the Rings.
Oh really? No, very little. Treebeard, I know about him. He's an Ent. He carried the hobbits to Isengard, I believe, if I recall correctly. I think it's the talking trees is like such a cool. It feels like an old school fantasy trope that like Pratchett won't let go of, and the fact that it actually obviously has a lot of this real world mysticism that you're describing, and like I talking about like electric trees and stuff like that. That's crazy. It's obviously where a lot of this inspiration comes from. It's really awesome. I'm really surprised that we don't have more of that in Discworld. I know you're saying we have had it in every book so far, but I don't want to get your hopes up that you're going to have it in every book going forward.
There's a couple other areas. I mean, mushrooms are incredible because they kind of replicate stuff. Um, I think one of the new Star Trek series has
the Mycelium Network, indeed.
Mycelium
Yeah.
Network, yes,
Star Trek Discovery.
a real thing. And it's to do with mushrooms. So I think that the main takeaway from Star Trek Discovery is take magic mushrooms. Is that?
Yeah, that's up there.
The other one.
Don't go to a party with Kevin Spacey, I think is the other one.
The other one is a quaking aspen, which was alluded to in a recent episode of Better Call Saul. And the quaking aspen is really fascinating. So it propagates through its roots to form large clonal groves originating from a shared root system. So you could have thousands and thousands of trees that
but it's one
grow
tree.
out of one tree.
Ah.
One clonal colony root system it's called the Pando, and it's in Utah, is considered to be 80,000 years old.
Whoa.
Yeah.
That's wow. Who knew? This is. I mean, I need to get out into nature a bit more. Obviously, this fascinating stuff. But obviously, all these connections to like fantasy and sci-fi literature, you can totally see how this is like such a big inspiration for these guys because it is like that's really magical, real world stuff. Like that's witch style magic right there, isn't it? You know.
Tree time.
Yeah. Cool.
So back to the.
What are we gonna do? What are we gonna do when there's no trees? Talking trees, we'll have to find some other scientific topics to try to delve into as we go forward. I really don't want to get your hopes up about the talking trees, or maybe I've just forgotten them. I don't know. We'll see. We'll just have to wait and see.
Yeah. So we get Granny training Escop, and that's quite interesting. What I really love about this first sort of 80 pages that I just wasn't expecting was that Terry goes full naturalist. It's like, here comes Seamus Heaney, here comes Robert Frost. When I have mentioned this happening in the last two books, but here's right the way through. You get real earthiness to it. You get strong smells, smoky wood, pine, dust,
Goats.
or fire and glass. It's like if this didn't have fantasy elements in it, it would be so much more embraced by the sort of the cultural literati of, shall we say, upper class literature.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Actually, it's not something that struck me at the time, but on this reread, yeah, certainly, I really felt that rural Lanker, or is it the Ramtops, really coming alive this read through, and like all the things you described. But the one that sticks out to me is the goats. The way that he writes about Granny's goats and the fact that they share a blanket, like Granny's cloak that she wears, her witch's cloak, is actually the goat's blanket during the winter, and just the idea that like what that must smell like, for example, but with the relationship that it implies between the human characters and nature. I think you're right. Yeah, it's sort of Walden-esque.
Henry David Thoreau's Walden, really worth checking out.
Absolutely. Although I would definitely read all the Discworld books first if I had my way. That's Thoreau's what I was forced to read at university, and this is what I was reading when I was skiving off. So maybe one was bleeding into the other somewhere down the road. So that's awesome. I mean, as you mentioned, there's a lot of Granny training up-esque, and it goes on for quite a while.
About a third, at least, around a third of the book.
Arguably more. I was reading that on the Kindle app, so it was giving me the percentage. So in my head, I have no strong recollection of when I first read this book. To the point where I was like, "Ooh, is this definitely one that I have read?" And then when I started reading it, some really vivid sequences came back to me. So it's worth talking about them now. So Granny has a magical power where she can borrow animals' bodies, and Esk has this like the wizard's magic kind of coursing through her veins, and she's a bit more strong-headed, and she wants to be a bit more forceful with her magic. And Granny tries to teach her about borrowing, which is basically hitching a ride in an animal's brain. But the trick to that is that you just hitch a ride, you don't take over, right? So Esk borrows an eagle's brain, but then gives into the urge to take over the body, and she loses herself in the eagle's mind, and she essentially becomes an eagle until Granny's able to rescue her. And that stuck with me. When I got to that sequence, I was like, oh yeah, I've read this. It was really, really vivid and really like nothing I think I'd ever read probably at the time. So I must have read it when I was relatively young. I'm just going to guess and say 12 or 13. And that was like no existential horror I'd ever encountered before. The idea and the vivid description of your self being erased, like that stuck with me. When I got to those pages, I was like, oh yeah, I remember being traumatized by this. You know?
Yeah, most definitely. They're quite visceral, they're quite pictorial. There's definitely an action through all this, but it's just very differently felt. I mean, it's not on a par of really anything in the last two books.
Yeah, sorry. So where I was going with that before I ended up kind of segueing into my childhood trauma was that my memory of the book was that it's about a girl going to Unseen University, right? Like that, equal rights, like that's what that's about. But that doesn't actually happen until, like, I think by my Kindle app, it doesn't actually happen until 60% of the way through the book. It doesn't happen until after the midpoint of the story. So if you're going into this book expecting that, oh, it's about a girl becoming a wizard, then you're going to be spending a lot of time going, when are we getting to the fireworks factory? But really, what it's about is about a girl learning two competing types of magic. And they happen to be characterized as a feminine type of magic and a masculine type of magic. But she spends the first half of the book learning to be a witch. So I think if you kind of adjust your expectations accordingly, you might find the pace a bit more agreeable.
Esk and Granny Weatherwax are making their way to a small sort of town called O'Hulan. Yes, O'Hulan.
It's a better stab at the pronunciation than I think I've ever managed to make in the intervening 20 plus years since I read it. Although speaking of town names, we never even mentioned the very cool name of the village that I asked from. Yeah, the village of Badass, which is obviously a play on, is it Bavarian or some German region where they have like Bad München, and Bad is like the prefix of place names. And just like, why be clever? Badass. That's a cool name for a place. And then I'm always with Pratchett, we're trying to kind of tease out like what the cultural cues are. Like I'm thinking the Ram Tops is a little bit Welsh, but then the Badass naming convention is obviously a play on some more mainland European, Germanic kind of linguistic things. And then what? Give me the town name again. Give me your pronunciation of it.
Yeah.
O'Hulan. Like, I don't even know. Like, is it Celtic? Is that us? I don't know. But yeah, I've never been able to pronounce it. So I like that somebody else is willing to have a stab at it for me.
Yeah, it could be an Irish thing.
Could be.
Celtic Gold Founders could be definitely an Irish or Gaelic thing. Yeah.
True. Yeah, so this is the first other witch that we beat in the story other than Granny. Any impressions about her? How did you find her as a character?
Not really. She was just one of those characters that were kind of there and did her job quite well. I mean, Granny's very kind of this feels like in some way Granny's first exposure to the world outside Badass.
Yeah,
is her one of her bridges to that.
Yeah, well, I guess that's kind of what I was kind of alluding to, is that she's obviously a lot more worldly, even within this limited sphere than Granny is. Granny's always complaining about foreign parts, as she calls it. Whereas, you've got this market town, and their witch is, let's not beat about the bush, their witch is implied to be the town abortionist. So that obviously implies a worldliness that we hadn't encountered in the story up until that point. So as we take a 9-year-old girl, like, and the main character is a 9-year-old girl, like as she goes out into the world, like she's going to be faced with the reality of it. And this is kind of the first implication of that,
Well, I was thinking, now that's a perfectly valid reason. I was thinking contraception. Both are perfectly valid. And it's kind of just there in the text. It's not, here's an agenda.
Oh, no, not at all. And
there. And I think it's stronger just because it is there.
Agreed. Not something I picked up on at all when I first read it. Not something I have a memory, obviously, of picking up on. As I say, I guess I would have been maybe 13 or 14 at the oldest when I read this book. But yeah, the further Esk gets from Badass, the more of the real world she's confronted with, like unvarnished, is really what makes this quite fresh.
So we've got the training and the journey and their evolving bond and that beautiful realism, and now the two of them are kind of splitting apart, and Esk's going to find her own way, and Granny's going to find her own way to Esk. And
do you find that odd? I mean, where they split up in this part of the story?
We've had this with Rincewind and Two Flower, haven't we? But
Yeah, that's a good point
It's
actually, and
kind
yeah,
of
and it's roughly around the same part of the story. So if we think about the Color of Magic and the Light Fantastic as one story, which it is, they split up around the midpoint, and the same happens with Granny and Esk. And I wonder why that is. I mean,
I think there's an element of right. We've seen these two characters grow for 100 pages now. Let's see them survive without one another. Let's see how independent they are. And yeah,
yeah, just as a way of breaking up, I
arguments that
guess.
they're not as
Mm,
independent as they'd like to
true.
think they are. Certainly.
Yeah, and I guess in both those stories, we spend a lot of time just with that same dialogue back and forth between the same two characters. So yeah, it definitely helps add some variety to the reading of the book. I would argue that because the story is a much slower burn and everything up until this point, I'm on board for it. I love seeing Esk learning to be a witch. As I said, this whole sequence about borrowing really stuck with me. But like I know they're gonna come back together again. So like this prolonged sequence where Esk gets lost and Granny has to look for her. Now it serves as a way of introducing Simon and Treadle. But other than that, I I don't know if I get a huge amount from it.
You practice magic?
Yeah, I practice magic. I mean, I've got the hat on. Unfortunately, the hat is a lie. I do not practice magic.
I don't know. Well, what is magic? Is it? I mean, I noticed Pratchett makes a few digs at Wiccas, which I
Mm.
thought particularly interesting because he's going for that sort of gay Wicca-esque thing, but he's not giving Wicca a free pass, which was interesting.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think it's an interesting one for me. I don't want to get like too personal with it or whatever, but definitely like that prioritization of like common sense over like yeah, dancing around the pentagram naked or whatever like that. That speaks to me quite a lot. I think magic as like a way of interpreting things that we don't yet understand, or as a way with dealing with things that are difficult to deal with otherwise. I think that that's where the real value of spiritualism or mysticism or even organized religion kind of comes in. And I think Pratchett really gets that. So I think it's natural then that Wicca is as fair game as any other kind of religion or spiritualism or whatever.
Right, right. I mean, I've never done the pentagram naked thing. It would have to be with the right company. There'd have to be lots of different colors of chalk for the pentagram, I feel. Um,
You got to make it
with
festive. Yeah,
candles and smelling salts. Um, I can't see it happening really. I mean, I'm getting
that's
on a
that.
bit.
Yeah, it's disappointing. But no, we're both respectable adults now, I suppose. But yeah, it's a good point.
Definitely an argument for saying magic is both that stuff that science doesn't understand yet, and then that feeling of quality
mm,
when everything is happening just beautifully, when you're storing up, when you're saving memories for the future that are just so special.
yeah,
Um,
yeah, and I mean, this is a world where unquestionably magic exists, but the the way that the witches, this book was really refreshing in terms of how it dealt with magic compared to the previous two books, in that it's taken a step away from those traditional fantasy tropes while keeping them part of the story, and then turning those two forces against each other, like that kind of common sense, natural stuff that we just talked about, the practical magic, and then the kind of high magic of fantasy, and that clash. But you're right. I mean, neither is let off the hook, and that's kind of what makes the conflict between them interesting.
I wonder I mean, magic nowadays, there's the element of corporate magic or pop magic where you design, you get the McDonald's swirl and all that
Yeah.
stuff Grant Morrison goes on about the Nike.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
And you could make a connection between that and Granny and Esk's exposure to the big cities for the first time and
Hmm.
the dazzling elements of that. Um, and then,
Yeah.
of course, I mean, Alan Moore's always going on about magic words being magic, grammar, grimoire. Um, and I think Granny talks about that quite a lot, about how it's knowing things and how we have Est learning to read through the course of it.
Oh yeah, yeah. The power of words.
Writer, I mean,
Well, yeah, no, and yourself too. And yeah, absolutely. It's something that I identify with in this book big time. And I had only reached the point yesterday where I actually got to that stage of the book, and it's like, oh yeah, asked kind of discovering words and Simon's connection to the written word and the literal magic that springs from that is something that I assume subconsciously had an effect on me when I first read this. Um, and yeah, I agree totally. There's magic. There's magic in words. There's like witches magic in words for sure. Even though the magic words we deal with in Discworld tend to be the high magic, the wizarding words. But no, I connected a lot with Simon as a character in general, but like his love of the written word for sure. So yeah, we should mention, or perhaps I should ask you about Simon and Treatle. And we meet them quite late on in the book, and the screenwriter in me, my eye twitches slightly whenever major characters are introduced after the midpoint, and I think he maybe sneaks Simon and Treatle in just under the wire.
yeah, they're maybe in about, in my version is 280 pages, and it's, I think maybe we meet down about 100, 120 pages in.
I'll allow it.
So Treacle, senior wizard. There's not a lot to him. He's pretty flaky and eccentric and given to changing his mind, which is why he's there. He's a plot device to get Esk in, because he's flip floppy.
Mm.
Probably a bit not all there. But Simon is. Do you feel the same way about Treacle?
Yeah, there's a quote, a line that stuck with me on this read through, which is about how he interacts with Esk, and I'm almost certainly misquoting it, but the gist of it is that he doesn't give enough thought to children to consider being cruel to them. They're just like just not in his world. And it's basically through his inability to deal with children that Esk ends up getting in the front gate. And it's interesting because there's kind of sprinklings of that in the Granny-esque relationship as well, which is like, as a grown-up, like, how do you interact with kids? It's weird, isn't it? And knowing where, like, Terry is in his life at this stage, when he's got a daughter about this age, Rihanna, that, like, is this kind of something that he's trying to work through, you know? But yeah, that kind of, I know Treatle isn't, well, according to that quote anyway, Treatle isn't trying to be cruel to Esk, but I think that kind of casual, unconscious cruelty that adults can inadvertently inflict on children, like, I think that feels quite true. It's not something that we necessarily expect to confront in this book. So yeah, even though, like you say, he's a bit of an exposition dump character, he exists as a plot device, I think there are like little elements of truth to him like that just show the skill of Terry's character creation.
Simon is a boy wonder. He is not the chosen one, but he is, big things are expected of him, big things he delivers. He's wrapped up in extreme anxieties. He's very hardworking. He's got a sort of tunnel vision kind of thing going on. I mean, he's genuinely bookwise, but it's kind of rear view mirror stuff. He's somebody who's very vulnerable to institutionalization.
Interesting, yeah.
It's only when he, as an outsider, drops in new perspectives and new knowledge that he starts, as he takes that in, he starts to lose his stutter and starts to evolve. Pretty late in the book, because the whole
he's introduced late in the book, so I mean, there's that makes sense.
I guess that then is the right time to talk about. We just talked about Simon. Yeah, the gender politics.
But indeed, yeah, that's kind of where we are. And as I sort of mentioned at the start, a Discworld book to me, the defining character almost of a Discworld book is that it has something to say about society. And this is the first of the Discworld books where I really feel that that's the case. So that said, I don't know, will I go first or do you want to? I'm on a roll. I'll continue. I still think he's kind of feeling his way around this one a little bit. I mean, it's a tricky one to tackle for any kind of middle-aged white man. Speaking as a middle-aged white man to another middle-aged white man, if you don't mind me saying. I think it's...
No problem, sis.
Yeah. Oh, well, I've got the hat, yeah. Obviously, our perspective, all of our perspective, me, you, and Terry Pratchett's perspective on this is going to be limited. And I feel like this, as the first book where he's trying to tackle something like this, that kind of shows. Like the dichotomy that he set up is that witch magic is feminine and wizard magic is masculine. But I feel like it's a misstep of sorts to portray Esk as like a tomboy before she starts her witch training, because that implies that like she has masculine traits and that's what makes her good, or that's what makes her able to do wizard magic. Whereas I think in this day and age, the discourse around gender politics has obviously evolved, and in this day and age we would say, no, well, I mean, why can't she be feminine and be a wizard? Why does she have to have these masculine traits to be a wizard? But then when I got thinking about that, and I was thinking about it in the context of the story, I was then kind of questioning myself, and I was wondering, actually, is it cleverer than that? And is it implied that she's a tomboy because she was given the staff? She literally puts her hand on the wizard staff the day she's born. And because she's imbued with that magic on that day, is that what makes her a tomboy? Because she has wizard magic in her? And then is it more of an argument about nature versus nurture? And it's like, and then it just becomes like this whole other thing. So I think like either way, it's kind of a little bit dated maybe, compared to the modern gender discourse, but definitely, the seed of something is planted here. And I don't want to like, put a hatchet in Terry here, because like the gender discourse across the whole book's evolves. And when we reach the very last book, and I don't want to spoil it, obviously, because we're only on book 3, but like this has changed. The way he approaches this is far less black and white by the time we get to the Shepherd's Crown, which is the very, very last book. And I'll say no more about that at the minute. I'm glad to see these seeds being planted here, but I think there's still a bit of a journey that he has to go on.
Thinking back to what I remember, the 1980s, and girls and women wanting to do traditionally male jobs, there was very much, and even before that, there was very much an approach of what we see here in the book.
Okay.
So we have Esk and Granny infiltrate the university by working or socializing and working down below in the downstairs. And it's a kind of they're sneaking in. There's a kind of a camouflage, sort of hidden in plain sight. And that was what I remember of the 1980s. It was the tomboys who got to do the traditionally male jobs.
Okay. Yeah, that's interesting. And that's really, really useful cultural context, because at the end of the day, we always have to remember this is a book that came out in 1987.
I should say those, shorter hair, performativeness, visuals as well.
Yeah. That's interesting, because as I say, like, we know that discourse has evolved, but we have to be mindful of the time and place that this was written. It's not a time and place that I remember particularly well, because in 1987 I was 1 year old.
You dress male, you can do a male job. Yeah,
so that was kind of the performative nature of it, I suppose, and that is something that, like, that is all over this book, isn't it? The way that Esk behaves. It does feel like she's kind of sticking her elbows out into the male world to stake her place in it, and obviously the way to do that is to act in a masculine way. So that the cultural context of that is interesting. That's a really interesting perspective. I hadn't thought about it that way because I wasn't really there, I suppose. But yeah, I can't wait for you to see the journey that the gender discourse of the series how that progresses, because it's really interesting to me, and it's so hard for me not to discuss it in broader terms. But
No, complete spoiler moratorium.
I know I'm done. Okay,
I don't even want to know the name of the next book until the end of the podcast. Although I do.
Well, come on, you have to allow me my crumbs.
And I've got to be. I have to keep you under a tight and similar, because I have learned a few things that I maybe shouldn't have known, and I've let them spill out.
It's hard not to. I mean,
for our creepers here, I had to take this plaque off the wall behind me because it was all askew. This is my certificate from Oxford Brookes University, Bachelor of Arts. I was the first kid in my family to go to university, and I said Oxford Brookes, not part of Oxford Official, but so it was a new university, but you were in the city where all that legend is, all that epic old buildings, cobblestones, archways, basalts. I don't even know what a basalt is.
No, no clue. And is that what you picture when you picture the unseen university then? Picture Oxford?
Very much, yeah.
Yeah.
Isn't it?
I picture Queens because I went to Queens, I guess, but similar vibe, isn't it? You know, it's red brick and it's old buildings and it's dustiness and it's, statues and absolutely, 100%.
Circumstance. Yeah.
Regalia. Absolutely. Yeah. That whole like
go until I was like about nearly 30, because the idea was that kids from bedsits didn't go to university, certainly not Oxford.
Yeah, no, fair play. No, respect. And Oxford Brookes is a fine institution from everything I've heard. I've never been to Oxford actually, but I have a few friends who've been to Oxford Brookes, including yourself, and they're all fine, upstanding individuals.
I got actually that certificate was given to me by Channel 4 newscaster Jon Snow.
Oh,
he knows things.
How can we make what Game of Thrones joke is it still kind of okay to make? Good for it. Oh wow, I got my degree certificate from Desmond Tutu. Well, that was pretty cool.
Wow.
Yeah, he was the speaker at ours. That was cool actually. Yeah, he's since left us, unfortunately, but that was a really inspiring day, actually. Unlike Ask's experiences in the unseen university, I suppose, to try to claw this back. Just reminiscing about our university days here with a witch's hat on and a glass of whiskey. It's like just a normal Wednesday night for me.
Yeah, so I think this is where, just in the reread that I noticed that this isn't just about gender. This is about social class.
Yeah.
It's about who gets into university and who doesn't. And Terry spends like a good few pages writing about this very specifically and directly. However, he addresses the issue that you should know your place. That certain people don't get to go in. So it's you have Granny and Esk figuring their way in there. Yeah.
And did that kind of ring true with your Oxford experience then, or your experience of Oxford as a place, that there was like a dichotomy between like the kind of the Oxford scholars and like everybody else?
It was, I did have instances where I encountered, shall we say, the Bullingdon streak
with Boris and Dave.
I had a few run-ins with a couple of those toffs, but I mean, I actually went over to Oxford because I knew a lot of cartoonists who came up through Oxford University, and absolutely lovely people, made me feel very welcome from the off.
Awesome.
The city is just so lovely. I mean, there's spoiled people wherever you go.
True.
And Oxford can be hard to survive in, but it's just a historic city. It's such a great experience, and most people were lovely. I mean, you've got like real strong sources of wonderful homegrown music, of left-wing political publications and investigative journalism. You've got a lot of blogging, big live journal thing back then. And I mean, they call it the Dreaming Spires, which is
Well,
nice.
true enough. Yeah. Oh well, that's great. I'm glad that your experience was so positive. Then
I think it's
you didn't have to work in the laundry. You didn't have to
no,
sweep the floors. No, that's brilliant.
just my own, just my own.
Yeah. Well, yes, we have to have some standards, I suppose, don't we? Um, and then we meet some other uh, characters at the university that are obviously going to play their part. I know that you expressed some enthusiasm about the new arch chancellor.
Yes, let's talk cut angle. Cut angle? Cut
And
angle?
I was
Cut
going to
angle.
say I was going to say Qtangle. I don't know
Cut
why it's
angle.
not spelled that way. Yeah,
I
it's
think we can go with either.
Cutang.
Those are two
Cut
runners up.
cut ang
Yes,
cut angle cut angle. What we say
the
the cut
cute
angle.
angle conjures images of a very senior wizard. He's very formal. Imagine he's like an old church rector or bishop or archbishop. He's
Uh,
sexist. He's
yeah.
closed off. He hasn't felt the warmth of humanity in a very, very long time. Um,
How do we think he compares to our previous? Because we've had what this is our third arch chancellor in as many books, isn't it? If we're counting.
I don't know. I didn't really get a beat on. Well, Tryman was a bit mad, I suppose.
Yeah, there's something a bit more pedestrian almost about cut angle or cut angle. I'm gonna go with cut angle now, just to mix it up. Yeah, that kind of casual sexism, and I think he's described as aldermanic, which I think is meant to mean that he's like a civil servant, like an alderman. Is that right? I don't know, but in this kind of casual way that he dismisses Ask, and it's like very much like he just said, set in his ways, unfamiliar with human warmth. I think that was a really good way of summing it up.
he's very like Galder in that you get the sense both of them were born in the university and they're going to die in the university.
That's a good point. I sort of feel that like at least Galder had enemies, so at least he had a bit of yeah, he had to stay on his toes to survive. Whereas I feel like the portrayal of Kat Angle is a bit more like a senior civil servant almost, or like a senior real life university bureaucrat. I might be projecting some recent issues I've had with university bureaucrats onto this reread. But just that kind of casual dismissal of other people, of humans, sort of feels a bit more grounded and a bit less high fantasy maybe than the arch chancellors that we've met previously.
Yeah, and we are given that sort of tough of Kutangle at first, and it's really, um, really lovely. It's almost like a reprise of the beginning of watching Kutangle and Granny Weatherwax's relationship grow. That's
Yeah, because those are two characters. I mean, and again, like we've discussed before, like with Cohen and the luggage, like two Discworld forces of nature that you're dying to see clash, and definitely Granny and Cut Angle are another pair. But like it goes to some interesting places. You felt.
yeah, most definitely. You've also got so again, it's a bit the narrative's a bit of a slow boil, but you get the university itself becomes it becomes a living entity, and it's got its own character and it's got its own personality. And I was looking back to it, and there's like 10 pages where Terry is guiding us through Esk in the university, spying on lectures, meeting Granny, visiting the library, and all this really plot important stuff's happening, but he's slipping all the university layouts, descriptions, all the rooms, and through the back door unnoticed, and it's just through the back door unnoticed.
Just like asking Granny.
That impressed me.
Yeah, absolutely. Like I have a really vivid impression of what the Unseen University is like in my mind, and on revisiting these first three books, it occurs to me that didn't come from The Color of Magic or The Light Fantastic. It came from this. It came from those sequences in Equal Rites where Esk is just going about her life in the university. It's really well described, and it is really vivid.
You went to Queen's yourself?
Yes.
And did you establish like a connection with that building? And how would you characterize that?
Yeah, well, that's an interesting one. Yeah, I suppose so. So if you're not familiar with Belfast, Queen's University Belfast is a big red brick building in the kind of what you would imagine a college at Oxford or Cambridge to look like, but nowhere near as rich or nowhere near as fancy. Um, and I was in the English department and the film studies department, which are based in these old Georgian houses that run alongside that main building. So yeah, when I think about Queens and I think about university and I think about that experience, like it's very much the main campus and College Avenue that I think about, and like all that stereotypical under the eaves in the quad, all that kind of stuff. But at the same time,
The
there's like some
eaves
yeah.
about the church kind of entrance.
So there's like covered walkways, you know. Maybe that's the wrong is that the wrong term?
Sorry, we didn't do Latin at my school.
Is that yeah? We actually did do Latin at my school, but doesn't mean I'm any good at it, unfortunately. But what is hilarious, what stuck to me, and it's almost Pratchettian, if we can coin that term, is that there's always like in amongst that these like really horrible, brutalist like 70s buildings that are like propped up obviously to host, new departments and lecture theaters and stuff. So like in the morning you could be in this like really old like Oxbridge style building lecture theater, then walk through the quad, through the dappled light coming through the trees, and walk into this like concrete monstrosity for your next tutorial, which is something I assume that they don't probably have in Oxford. So Queens is like a weird dichotomy in that sense, where it's like it's trying to be something, but it's like not fully succeeding at it. Like you can see the cracks around the edges,
It's a little bit patchwork. I mean, I think Queens is by and large is more alike classical Oxford, whereas Brooks would have been those little patches of
Oh yeah, sure, yeah, I've heard that.
technology
Yeah.
and bright lights
Yeah.
everywhere.
But when you think of Queens, you think of that one building, the big red building on University Road. But like, there's other buildings that are just horrible, and they're just part of the scenery of Belfast. They're just on other streets and other roads that you wouldn't necessarily know about it. So yeah, and there's something kind of unseen university esque about that, in that like you don't necessarily know if you get like sent up, you look at your timetable and you get sent up the Stranmillis Road and you go into this building and you hope it's a Queen's building, because if it's not, it's just going to be like a solicitor's office or something like that. So it's like literally unseen.
Um,
You weren't missing out if that's what you're worried about. You definitely weren't missing out.
so the things with the grey things lurk, and these are kind of been brought on by Simon, and I suspect Esk's overuse of magic.
Yeah,
They're trying to enter our dimension.
and these are beings that we have encountered in the series so far. It's worth mentioning, right? This is the Dungeon Dimensions people, right? Am I right? Am I right?
From when the Octavo opened.
Yeah. So my understanding, and I could be again projecting, because obviously, like once you've read the whole series or whatever, or you're deep in the series, you kind of impose, rightly or wrongly, your own version of canon on it, I guess. But my recollection, I think still my kind of understanding, is that like these are the Dungeon Dimension guys who are coming for Simon and Esk, right? This is the Dungeon Dimensions. Is it?
Yep.
What do you think?
I don't know. Were they there? I mean, the only point I could trace them to was the Octavo and Trimon's. Well, not just the other spells.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, did Trimon?
Because the Dungeon Dimensions themselves are quite poorly defined. It's just like they're beings, extra dimensional beings who occasionally show up to mess with wizards for whatever reason the plot kind of demands, and it sort of feels like that it's better developed in this for sure. And I noticed that your mate Bell Shamroth got a shout out.
Got to mention Bell Shamroth.
Yeah, so are these are the is this the same guys? I'm not really sure, but even if it's not specifically the same guys, it's like it's a similar idea, right?
Yeah.
So
I feel like got more build up in the light fantastic. Well, just by point of the Octavo always being in Rincewind's brain. The alieny guys don't really show up until Treadle and Simon do.
Yeah.
And they're kind of connected to Simon.
So, and are we starting to feel, or is there a concern in your mind now that you're on book 3 of this series. There's been lots of talking trees, and there's been lots of like extra dimensional goobers who show up in the second half of the books to kind of fight with wizards. Is your concern that these motifs are just going to repeat and repeat?
Contrary to popular opinion, I'm quite a patient man. And I not really know. If we get to book 6 or 7, and it's still such a similar formula, let's say, that's as harsh as I can be about it.
Yeah.
Because I've loved every minute of it.
Oh, that's good. That's good. And maybe it's just because I'm kind of rushing my way through them back to back, where I just sort of, it didn't hit me the first time I read them. It's like, oh, right. So it's another magical battle with demons from another dimension. Okay.
So I think there's a few big differences in it. So we had Rincewind. These were inside his head, and everything was from his perspective. And he's quite an old fellow, whereas Esk is quite young, and the battles are in Simon's head. Simon's quite young.
And then the way they defeat them is obviously quite novel, and it's what makes this an improvement, I think.
Yeah, there's I find it far more descriptive, this sort of juju battle this time. Starts to get into like mentions of Morse code and strobes and prisms and a disc within a disc within a disc. Much more entertaining light show.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I think his descriptions of how these kind of set pieces can be put to paper, I think is definitely improved. And as you say, the stakes are higher with younger characters always. Yeah, I mean, this is basically the Stranger Things of the Discworld. This kind of set piece, isn't it?
Yeah.
And in terms of how they defeat these grey things, this idea that they have to kind of not use their magic, sort of counterintuitive notion.
The important thing about magic is how you don't use it. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah. So I thought that, especially compared to how the Tryman business played out, I thought that was kind of, oh, that's good, because we're dealing with younger people. Hopefully they're going to learn. First of all, hopefully they're going to survive, and secondly, hopefully they're going to learn something from this. So yeah, they've both had access to this unbridled power, and it's about growing up. It's when you're the tragedy of being a grown up is that you have money to buy all the video games that you want, but you don't have time to play them. So when you grow up, you have access to all the magic that you could want, but you can't use it, or you shouldn't.
Much
use
like
it.
my Humble Bundle Kindle collection.
Oh yeah, stop my humble bundle list. God knows.
Full screens.
So I think it's quite a clever metaphor for growing up. That, and even though it's another battle against extra dimensional whatevers, like I think it's got enough of a spin to it with these younger characters. But I'd prefer it. I mean, we've discussed my kind of issues with Rincewind and stuff previously. So like, if I had to go with like the dimensional battle with extra dimensional beings from this book or from the Light Fantastic, this is the one I would pick. So yeah, this is what it comes down to for me at this moment, because as I mentioned, for me, this is like the first of the real proper Discworld books. So are you feeling a big step up from the last two?
Let's shelve that for now. Let's shelve.
Ooh, okay. What do you want to talk about instead?
But if we're throwing digs in, okay,
yeah,
about repetition, where I did find it noticeable was that there's another bait and switch. So there was a bait and switch in the Light Fantastic where it's moved us away from Rincewind and Tryman, is that right? Before we get to the finale of that. And it happens again here in that we leave Esk and Simon and the other things, and we go back to Granny and Katangle.
Oh yeah, that's true. Yep.
Like true, it's so it is a dialogue between them and their relationship that sticks the landing of the book. It resolves very well.
Yeah.
Out in the middle of the storm, together, Katangle re-examines his position. What do what do you make of this? Foes to flirting. Can you remember?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I love Granny's a great character. I've been when I first read the series, I realized quite recently that I'd been misremembering her. I'll maybe talk about that when we get to Weird Sisters a bit more, but I had confused in my head somewhere down the line the description of Granny Weatherwax with the description of Nanny Og, who's like a much larger, physically larger, and also emotionally larger than life character. So to get back to this version, the real version of Granny, who is like the more severe, kind of no nonsense, the way that she's meant to be, and then these kind of first kind of inklings of there being more to Granny, and obviously it's going to come from a wizard because it's the whole opposites attract kind of thing, is great, absolutely, but it's fair to say you're right that the cutaways to it, does it feel like a bit of a cop out rather than describing this full battle? I think a lot of what would help this book actually is if Terry was kind of more willing at this stage in his career to play with points of view. So if, for example, we'd have had a dual narrative, if we'd have had Esk's story from page 1 and Simon's story from page 1, and then they come together at the midpoint, I think that maybe would have felt a bit more natural if we'd have had, but he never doesn't spend a great deal of time cutting between points of view in this book. We cut between Granny and Esk when they get separated, but that's only for 20% of the narrative, a fifth of the narrative, maybe. So I feel like, yeah, exactly. So I feel like he's still not really comfortable with like a dual narrative, dual points of view. So yeah, I mean, I agree it's an issue, but any scene where Granny is outside her comfort zone is a pleasure always. So it's kind of worth it.
I thought the description of the storm was absolutely amazing. You can hear the glugs and the drains and the battering rain. It's all there in his prose, and it's that naturalism thing going to
absolutely
another level. You get that sort of, it's not in a comparison with the light fantastic, but it is mini apocalypse. You've been out in a storm today, haven't you?
Tell me about it. Yeah, I mean,
from a window.
Yeah, we've had a lot of that kind of weather the last few days. So yeah, again, like that those are the kind of pages that you love to read, curled up inside under a blanket, looking out the window. Absolutely. Oh man, I've got a lot of time for this book, a lot more time for this book than I remembered.
So with all of the messages, all the messages the book Terry raises, what is the conclusion? How do these issues play out in terms of plot? I don't know. I haven't thought about that one.
Well, I guess I maybe jumped the gun on it slightly. That kind of answer to the question of how do we defeat these things, or how do Simon and Esk continue to exist in this world with the powers that they have, is to not use them. I mean, that's how the plot is essentially resolved. But as I said, I think it's a lesson about growing up, and I don't think it sidesteps the gender politics issue, but I think there's recognition there that those aren't issues that can be resolved in a fantasy novel. The issues of those kind of gender politics issues, and it's for the best that he doesn't, because he's going to come back to them again and again and again in the series. But I think he is able to resolve the kind of the way that Simon and Esk experience those issues as children, as young people. So that feels like enough for me in terms of where the plot resolution and the kind of thematic resolution come together. It gives enough for me to be satisfied, I think.
Yeah, I think there's compromise and there's surrender. I mean, Granny, Weatherwax, and Cadangle start off as sworn enemies, and on the last page they're having quite a cozy chat with a lot of mutual respect in the air.
I'm raising my eyebrows suggestively. For those who haven't read it, no, obviously you've read it if you're listening to us. But yeah, and like any of that kind of stuff with Granny, and again, without saying too much, there's more witches coming anyway. So any of those kind of situations with Granny is always going to be it's always going to be worth reading, as far as I'm concerned. So I think you've put it off long enough. We need a verdict. Now that we have 3 books, dare we do a top 3? Has that put you on the spot? I didn't ask you to think about that beforehand, so
yeah,
it might be.
Let's have a go. Oh, right. So I have to do it in like number 3, which is The Color of Magic. You know what? Number 2, this book, The Equal Rites.
Okay.
And Light Fantastic one. But if you originally asked me to treat Color of Magic and Light Fantastic as one story.
Yes.
And face them off against Equal Rites. And under those rules, I say Equal Rites.
That's interesting. And I think that's actually a really generous way to do it, because they are 3 books. It published as 3 books at the end of the day, but they are 2 stories. So yeah, I think that's actually really, really fair comparison. I think for me, definitely as a straight comparison, one story versus the other, Equal Rites wins out. I think Equal Rites might pip the Light Fantastic for me just barely as a standalone reading experience as well. And bear in mind, that's coming from somebody who read the Light Fantastic as their very first Discworld book, so it was kind of mind-blowing. But on the reread, I don't know. I just at that stage of my life where I just like, those kind of, the way he portrays youth, child characters, the way he writes children, just like, I just find it so authentic and so real. And just like, even though my kids are a bit younger, I just like, I can just see so much of them in Ask, and I'm just like project as a father, just project a lot of like my own baggage into this story.
Truly amazing.
Absolutely. And I
feels like a child.
Yeah. And even though like I have huge is the stretch, I have issues with the structure of the story for sure. I just like find myself like, even though I know what happens, and I was kind of surprised. I'd forgotten how long that sequence was of before they get to the Unseen University, but I just so enjoyed spending time with Granny and Esk, and just like that kind of adult child relationship just felt so authentic, and I was just able to project so much of my own relationships with my own kids into it and stuff that just pips it over the top for me.
I was surprised by the whole pacing thing, and really surprised actually, and I think it pays off. It's actually, you know what, if the whole book had been paced now, well, maybe not. I loved it for what it was, I think. The shift to Granny and Katangle's relationship, I said that's what sticks the landing, and it leads to Katangle re-examining his position, leads to Esk getting admitted. Granny is now admitted as well, which was a even bigger surprise.
Yeah.
So I think there was an awful lot of setup that did pay off.
True. Yeah, absolutely. No, and you're right. And like, bringing it back, I guess, to what I said at the start, like a lot of my issues with the pacing of it come just from my own possibly flawed recollection of what the story was, which is it's about a girl who goes to wizard school when it's not, So that's fair. And actually, when you read the blurb, I was kind of expecting to have a wee gotcha moment that like, oh, the marketing team have done him dirty there, but actually they didn't really. They left it much, much more open than I remembered. So that's totally, those expectations were totally my own.
Do you have a favorite quote, PJ?
Yes, I do. I think I can do it off the top of my head, or I can do something close to it, which is that Esk had learned that when you ignore the rules, people quietly rewrote them to accommodate you, which is one of the all-time famous Pratchett quotes. And I just think like it's just one of probably the quote, certainly of the books that we've read so far, that sums up how well Terry observed human nature, and especially to do it from the perspective, or to put it in context of like a headstrong 9-year-old girl just kind of going through the world, doing her own thing. I think it's quite empowering, and it's. I remember the first time I read it, certainly, you know, like it being kind of a shocking revelation. Like I read it when I was young, thinking like, "Oh shit, is that true? Like, is that real? Could I do that? You know, would that work if I did it? You know." So that's one that stuck with me, and it was a kind of a joy to encounter it again, kind of forgetting where it had initially come from. The other thing I'll quickly mention that I won't quote though is we're not at the stage where we have lots of footnotes yet, but there is a footnote in this book that basically lays out the whole way that Ankh-Morpork works in terms of the guilds, the thieves guilds and assassins guilds, and how crime is legalized. And it's just like a footnote in this book where they don't even really spend a lot of time in the city itself. And that has just such big implications for the world going forward. Yeah. And I had completely forgotten that it first rears its head as like a footnote in this, like in the kid goes to wizard school book. So that kind of blew my mind a little bit. But that's it. Those are my picks.
Mine is a long one. It could double as a favorite moment. The snake became a giant reptile from the mists of time. The basket became the snow wind of the ice giants, coating the struggling monster with ice. The reptile became a saber-toothed tiger, crouched to spring. The gale became a bubbling tar pit. The tiger managed to become an eagle, stooping. The tar pits became a tufted hood. So it's Granny and Katangle's battle. And as I was reading it, the Sandman, I think it's issue 4 or 5, his battle with Lucifer, which is a word battle. It's kind of iconic, and it struck me that Neil Gaiman must have stolen that for this. And fair enough, Gaiman makes it his own, and he really takes it so much further. Yeah. But it's all there, and it's all so well done there as well.
Yeah, and you know that anything that Gaiman borrowed from Pratchett would have been borrowed with permission, you know, given their relationship. Yeah, gosh,
I think that's our part of our job as creatives, is to steal things, but the most important part of that is to do it with grace and style, and you know, use it. If you're going to use it properly.
Of course, yeah, and yeah, the sequences in both those stories are really well done, and the way it was adapted for television recently was really well done as well, I thought. And yeah, and any kind of magical fight that doesn't involve dudes with beards throwing fireballs at each other, like, you know, that's why I don't write fantasies, because I couldn't come up with something like that. You know, mine would just be the dudes with fireballs. So yeah, any writer that can write with that level of originality to portray something like that, just that blows my mind every time. It's great.
Oh, I'll give a quick runner-up if I can.
Of course, I did too. So
I must have crossed the same river, thousands of times. But it wasn't the same river.
The steady march of time, the river's always flowing. It's not the same water. Yeah, and those get like, I love all the
Weatherwax Kutangle moment. So I must
wow, that's left an impression on you.
Yeah,
you're gonna have to go. You're gonna have to go out into the world and find your own Granny Weatherwax, are you? Oh, I've got the hat.
I'll tell you what my bright spot was.
Yes, please do.
The broomstick racing into Ankh-Morpork as dawn was spreading.
Oh yeah,
just out racing dawn.
Yeah, that's a cool moment.
Just lovely.
Yeah. And it's like, yeah, terrifying in some ways, but like, yeah, this idea that you can literally outpace the dawn is just like, it's just inherently magical, isn't it? It's a great moment in the book. That's when Granny and S come back together to finish their initial mission. So a great set piece. Yeah, I know we sort of came in a bit critical of the book, but like, I do have a real fondness for it. Certainly out of the 3 that we've read so far. If you'd have asked me before we started the podcast, like before we started the very first episode, if you'd asked me to rate the first 3 off the top of my head, I probably would have rated them the same as you did initially, with the light fantastic up top. But like, yeah, my perspective's definitely shifted a little bit, I think, during the last few weeks. So
we didn't mention Josh Kirby's wonderful cover last time.
Oh yeah, because we were too busy talking about comics and stuff like that.
And I think there's so much part of the books for me.
Yeah. Oh no, me too. To be fair, yeah.
I never really look at them properly until after I've read them, and then I try not to get too much into assigning which character on the cover is which character on the inside. So I think that detracts a bit from the magic of it. I think that they're sort of tonal pieces. This one's all fire and flame.
Yeah, that's fair. And they're so they're so stylistic. You don't necessarily want to get that character image stuck in your head. Yeah.
There's something a little bit. There's almost like a sort of a religious art element to them. You've got like pantheons of angels, and
Yeah.
I know that's not the correct group name for angels, but that's
Choir?
a celestial thing for a collective, a flock of angels. Or
Choir of Angels, I believe.
choir, yeah.
Yeah, hold it up. Hold it up for anybody who's watching the video there.
Yeah, very, very shiny.
So something maybe we shouldn't get into this, but there's something about the way that Ask is kind of holding her broomstick that is kind of, tells you that you're getting into a story about gender politics. Let's just put it that way.
I have no idea which one Ask is. Oh yes. Yeah, it's because these covers, they play tricks on you. Characters appear and disappear out of it. Yeah.
And that's what put me off them really back in the day. Like as a kid, they were just sensory overload, but I feel like a much greater appreciation for them now, especially the nostalgia factor. But yeah, there's definitely something a bit phallic going on with the way that Ask is kind of holding the broomstick, and it just lets you know that you're in for a discussion about these things, I think.
It's a really tight use of space in these things. I mean, which is odd because a quarter of the cover is background.
Yeah, that's true. The back, but sometimes you find details on the back that you never knew were there.
Yeah, there's a little duck in this one.
Oh yeah, there you go. See, I set that up as if I knew that you were going to find one. But
so, shall we move to our new letters to Discworld section called Going Postal? Is that what it's called?
It probably should be, although that's going to take at least what?
We'll
20 or 30 months to pay off.
a while. So the big thing that we've got very excited about are just after we recorded the last 2 episodes, we learned that we were number 48 in the charts for Apple UK's podcasts about books.
Yay!
It's a pretty big thing. Yay!
Yeah, we're excited about that. That was cool. Thanks everybody who listened and put us in that position. That's awesome. Really appreciate the support.
Cool. We didn't get any emails, but we did get a nice DM today from Roasty Buns.
Ooh.
Hey guys, just finished episode 2 and the podcast is going great. Thanks for answering my question. My personal experience with Pratchett is an odd but great one. I played the Discworld game on PS1 as a kid without even knowing it was a book series. Then when I was about 10, Sky One started advertising this new show that looked really cool called The Hogfather. And I watched that without even making the connection that it was part of the same series I'd just played on a game a few years prior. I was wondering if any of you had known about the video game adaptations. Thanks again for a great podcast. Roasty Buns.
How long have you got? Have you played the games?
I was aware of the text. There was one of the text games that was maybe going about.
Oh, there was a MUD, if I remember. You're old enough to know what a MUD is, right?
I should be.
Like a text-based adventure, like an online collaborative text-based adventure. Yeah, so there was a Discworld MUD for sure. The PS1 game was like a point-and-click Monkey's Island style kind of adventure, and you were Rincewind. And then there was Discworld 2, which was also on the PS1 and PC, and it's the same. Just point and click puzzles, find the items, put the key in the chest, solve the puzzle kind of thing, and they were really good. I was crap at them, so I never finished either of them. And then there was a 3D one called Discworld Noir, which was of the exact spoof that you're thinking of. It's like you're a gumshoe, it's a film noir parody. And I was terrible at that as well. So I've played all of them and didn't get very far in any of them. But yeah, I mean, if you talk to people like Roasty Buns and many, many others, like those games were an entry point for a lot of people to to the series, especially in the kind of mid-90s, I guess. So I would love to go back and revisit them if we ever find the time to do another special episode. I think the video games would be a really, really good candidate for that.
I think so. I'm not much of a gamer. I haven't really been since the 1980s. But I'd love to stick out a few of the games, and we'll give those a trial and a commentary. Um, Dan Harth joins us as a new reader.
Welcome, Dan.
Henry Chamberlain on YouTube writes, Terry Pratchett is God. The Colour of Magic may be the best known from the series. That's an interesting point he makes.
It's true. I know, and it's a shame in some ways because obviously there's so much more. But I mean, it's book one of anything is going to be the most well known, isn't it?
I want to give a quick shout out to Ian Lawther, who helped make the tech possible.
Awesome, thank you.
Thanks, Ian. And we have the only other thing we have is when we put new episodes up on Anchor, we put up a poll and a Q&A.
Oh, yeah.
And we had a poll results just asking people, have you read Discworld? Emily, yes, many times. A person with lots of numbers in their name says, I've been slowly working my way through on Weird Sisters currently. Connor McCann says not all of it, but 75%.
Shout out to Connor. He's an old friend of mine.
Hi, Connor.
Thanks, Budge.
And Kel says not all of them, but working my way through them.
Oh, we messaged Ross, who said yes. Sorry. I talked over you when you were talking. He said Ross said yes.
They do that always sunny all the time, and that's an award-winning show, sort of.
Yeah, it's loose. It's cool, man.
So
awesome.
A lot of like second-time readers or people like yourself who are not quite.
Yeah, not all. Yes, we've got two people there who are not all. We've got one here slowly making their way through. So that is interesting because I think that like maybe people feel the same way I do, that like it's time, that like we know now we've been able to make our peace with the fact that there's no more Discworld coming, and now it's just time to work our way through. So I'm excited. It's great to get that feedback, guys. So that's awesome. Looking ahead, oh man, I just got to say, actually, off the back of that, it's just put me in mind of it that like going right back to the start of this book, the introduction to Granny's cottage when we first got there, it made me kind of emotional because in the very without spoilers, Andy, in the very very last book, which Terry knew he was writing towards the end, Granny's cottage plays a really key part of that story, and it just sort of felt that like being back there in that place as it is introduced for the first time just made me remember why I'm doing this, which is to kind of complete the series for good, and it just made me feel a little bit emotional. So any book that can evoke, any series that can evoke those kind of emotions is worth sticking with, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, there's a very special bond between Pratchett and his readers.
Absolutely. And are you feeling it yet? Are you starting to feel it?
I'm being schooled. Oh, yeah.
Okay, well, yeah, but I mean, it's not just about,
Yeah.
Good. Oh, that's good. I'm so glad.
It's just, as I said with Equal Rites before, it's not what I thought it was. So, yeah, the initiation period for me, definitely.
And are you looking forward to more witches?
Maybe.
Which witches are you looking forward to?
Oh, don't ask me that.
Just an excuse to say which witches.
You know what? I don't even know the name of the next book.
Okay.
I think I do. Is it Mort?
Yes, Mort is next. And now, it's not a spoiler because it's really like page one knowledge. Like if you look on Goodreads, I think you'll see a significant jump in the star rating between these first three books and the next one. Now, for all the reasons I've already discussed, for me, Equal Rites is kind of the first proper Discworld book. A lot of people will say Mort, and you're going to find out why.
Okay. Looking forward to that. So our main hosting page is anchor.fm/I've never read Discworld. And we've got links on like 9 podcast providers. You can email us at I've never read Discworld@gmail.com. We're all around the web too, aren't we, PJ?
Everywhere. YouTube, Facebook, Twitter. We're at Discworld GNU on Twitter. And if you're listening or watching on Spotify, be sure to take part in our poll and Q&A.
And that's it. Thanks everybody for interacting. Keep all that up. Hope you enjoyed this one. And
The
yeah,
granny weatherwax hat has been removed. Andy, you can now say that you have.
read some Discworld.
Thanks, everybody. We'll hopefully see you next time.